Well, good evening. I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Urbana City Council for Monday, December 16th, 2019. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Council members Brown. Here. Hazen.
Here.
Hersey.
Here.
Jacobson. Here. Miller.
Here.
Roberts.
Here.
Wu.
Here.
Mayor Marlin.
Here. Next up is approval of minutes from the previous meetings, December 2nd, 2019, and then the public hearing from the same date. Is there a motion for approval?
Move to approve.
I'll second.
Moved by Sharice, seconded by Jared. All those in favor, any other corrections? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? That motion passes. Are there any additions to the agenda? Seeing none, we'll go to presentations and public input. I'm going to use my chair's prerogative and move a presentation by the fire up to be before the facilities master planning phase 2 report, because the fire presentation is going to be much, much shorter.
Okay, Mayor, Council, thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little presentation with you this evening. We had our Fire Ops 101 that we had invited our council to be a part of, and some of you took advantage of that opportunity. I've got some pictures up on the screen. I will give credit where it is due. I put together a little PowerPoint, gave it to Fahmy, and she actually really put together a nice finished PowerPoint for me, so I greatly appreciate that. So I'm going to explain as we go through the pictures. The first picture there is the picture of the people, the candidates that went through the process with their shadows, and each of them were there, had a picture in front of our engine company before we got started in the activities for the day. The next one is a picture of our mayors from Champaign and from Urbana. Mayor Marlin is there with her turnout gear on, air pack, helmet, prepared to get ready to get rolling. So we greatly appreciated having everybody there and to take part in this process. The gearing up process, each member had a shadow that assisted them with the entire process that day. That shadow stayed with the participants throughout the operations throughout the day. So they were there with them, partnered with them throughout the day to make sure that the scene was safe for the candidate, and the candidate had all of their questions answered. If they had questions throughout the process, they had those questions answered. The gear that was worn that day, the turnout gear, the bunker coat, bunker pants, boots, helmet, hood, gloves, and air pack were about 50 pounds. So about 50 pounds of gear that each candidate wore throughout the day. Through those activities, they had that 50 pounds on their back, additional throughout everything that they were doing throughout the day. So that doesn't count any tools that they carried, any hose lines, any mannequins that they had to drag. So it was 50 pounds, just the gear alone. I don't know if I stressed that enough, 50 pounds. So they moved on to the roof ventilation. They had to climb up to the roof ventilation. It was approximately about 8 feet up. Climbed up to a platform that was had 4x8 sheets of plywood on it, and the candidates used an 8-pound sledgehammer to create a trench cut, if you will, about 4 feet long. So they used the edge of the sledgehammer to cut that little cut in the roof, as we would do if we had that tool on a normal roof. We had the benefit of being on a flat surface instead of a pitched surface, but it was still a little bit of work to get that that little trench cut throughout, and they did a great job sticking with it and getting their cuts made through that process. This was for vertical ventilation simulation. They cut it so that it gave a little bit of an indication what we would do in vertical ventilation to let the heat and the smoke out of the house to get that heat off of the firefighters in the event that we went into a structure fire. Auto extrication was next. Moved on to auto extrication. The candidates had the opportunity to remove the glass from the side windows. Some relished that opportunity, and it was just a good time to be able to see what it was like to have to break that side window, which in Hollywood looks fairly easy, but wasn't quite as easy as what it looked, was it, Mayor? A little tough. So from there, they had the opportunity to use the cutters, which we call the jaws of life, and they cut the posts of the vehicle, and so that they could eventually at the end take the roof right off of the top of the car. They also had the opportunity to use the spreaders. These tools are extremely heavy, so as they use the tools, just learning how to support that underneath as they were using the tools to cut the B-posts and use the spreaders on them. From there, they moved on to the emergency medical. In the emergency medical, we had a station set up where we had firefighter paramedics that were at these stations and talked a little bit about some of the interventions that we do out in when we go on EMS calls. They also had the opportunity to do a little bit of chest compressions for CPR simulation at this station, and they also had the opportunity to ask questions as far as what our EMS calls do, what we carry, things like that with the process. At the end, we had the opportunity to get together and get our picture. In the completion of the day, we were all tired, sweaty, a little sore, but happy for the opportunity that we had to get together for the day and just kind of enjoy a little bit of that learning process in the process. We do have some of our firefighters here. You guys want to? As they come up, I'm going to kind of do a little explaining of the helmet, the leather helmet. As most of you know, that helmet that you had an opportunity to wear that day was a little cumbersome and probably gave you a little bit of a headache by the time you were done that day. But the traditional leather helmet was developed in 1821 by a New York City FDNY volunteer. It was very primitive at the time. The Carnes brothers then came in. They refined the helmet a little bit, put the wires around the brim, made the brim a little bit wider so that the water, the debris, and things like that stayed out of the face of the firefighters. And they also put what we call the beaver tail on the back of it. And that is basically the stuff that keeps the embers, the water, and things like that out of the back of our coats and somewhat dry. The helmet itself weighs anywhere from 55 ounces to 76 ounces, or 3.5 pounds to 4.75 pounds. So wearing that for any length of time, as you got to experience, you had a bit of a headache. So I will tell you, as your shadows are here today to present you with your helmet, I will say that one of the most valued pieces of equipment, personal protective equipment that we have as firefighters, is our helmet. When we retire, the one thing that we get that we value the most is our helmet. It is what we wear throughout our career. It is what protects us from any kinds of injury that we may have. So it is something that we value very, very much, and we appreciate what you did, the time that you took. So I'm going to allow them to, one at a time, come to you and to present to you your helmet. and then I'd have a few words afterwards. So, Cap, you want to go first?
Well earned. Wow, that's heavier than I'd like to. Probably seems heavier now. The other day, there was more adrenaline to go with it. You heard it, I appreciate it.
Hey, Trent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Trent. And it weighs 20 pounds, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Best shadow ever. Thank you, Jake.
Get your, yeah, we're gearing up here for our picture.
Well, the rest of the council should make a motion requiring you to wear it the whole meeting.
Well, thank you for being kind to an old man.
So with that, I do have to especially thank our shadows that were there that day. Our shadows were there to make sure that your day was a success, and hopefully you enjoyed every moment of the opportunity. I do have a couple of other thank yous, I guess. You know, we thank you for the opportunity this evening. We want to thank our brothers and sisters from Champaign Local 1260 who invited us to take part of this process with them. The University of Illinois Fire Service Institute, who were gracious hosts in this process, that have a wonderful playground, that we're able to go out and do a lot of training, and it is some great opportunities to train out there. I want to especially thank our firefighters here of Local 1147. They worked extremely hard to get this thing set up, and they've been through this process from the start with their brothers and sisters from 1260. I'm extremely proud of our firefighters here and the work that they do on a regular basis, and this was just a little touch of being able to experience something that they have set up. So greatly appreciate what they do every day. And to you guys that took part in this thing, thanks so much. Thanks for taking your Saturday to come out and see a little bit about what we do, and to take your Sunday to heal a little bit after your Saturday. So it was a good time for us, and we appreciate your time, so thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Sunday was, Advil was my friend all day. Next on the agenda is a presentation on our facilities master planning, project phase 2, Vince Gustafson, and then we have staff from Canon Design. And I'll let Vince introduce our guests.
Good evening. I'd like to start off by introducing representatives from the consulting firm Canon Design from Chicago. Sitting next to me is Chris Lambert in the audience joining us, who've been very helpful in the information we're about to present this evening. So I'm Kitty Franz, Pam Steiner, and Chirag Patel. And this evening we are here to present the key findings and opportunities from the second phase of our facilities master planning effort, which is a space and programming needs. I'll start off just kind of a brief recap of the project and how we got started and how we got here today. In 2018, we released an RFP for the purposes of hiring a consulting firm for facilities master planning. And as a reminder, the project goal is development of a sound, actionable, and fiscally responsible facilities plan that supports the entire city government organization by providing safe and inviting work environments that meet the varying operational needs of all city departments. In June of this year, I presented to this group the findings of the first phase of that study, which is the facilities condition assessment. And that was a detailed report of the existing conditions of the physical assets. If you'll remember, we took all of our facilities and we broke them down into systems, and then we broke those systems down into components, and we put together a prioritized listings of all the deficiencies and assigned how we should best tackle those physical asset needs. Each facility was assigned an FCI, or a Facilities Condition Index, and that helped us put together, just looking strictly at the facilities and the conditions, sort of a 10-year plan in how we were going to address the needs. And if you remember, we came up with some pretty staggering numbers to the tune of $8 million of noted deficiencies over the next 10 years. So at conclusion of that phase, we started to engage in the next round, which is phase 2, which is space and programming needs. Now, where before we were looking at the physical conditions of the assets was inside the building, with this phase, we're looking more at the space, how we occupy it, how the departments use the space, and how we function interdepartmentally between all the different areas of work that we do here for the city. So to better describe this process, I'm going to turn this over to Chris Lambert to describe how we came to the conclusions we found today.
Thanks, Vince. And thank you to the mayor and the council for letting us have the chance to present in front of you today. So what we're going to try to do is walk through this Phase 2 report, which really is, in many ways, leading into Phase 3, which is ultimately a master plan for thinking about the future state of those facilities. So this is very much a kind of transition point. I think what you'll see on the subsequent slides is a summary of some high-level findings that really represent that Phase 2. So just to walk through some activities that our team went through with City of Urbana staff across all departments. We held a visioning session very early in the process to goals for the overall process, understand where there might be opportunities for improvement within the way the City of Urbana is using its facilities today, and also as it relates to how teams might be more equipped to work together. So it was really a vision and priority setting. We conducted a survey of employees. We got a very good response rate, more than 150 responses from across all city departments, and have a good sense, I think, of the work patterns that people have today and some of the challenges they might face in the delivery of their responsibilities. We conducted a series of 5 focus groups encompassing plus or minus about 50 employees, so we got sort of on-the-ground perspective from some key people within the organization. These are really focus groups at the manager level and below, so kind of a bottom-up perspective. And then a series of leader interviews with about a half dozen different groups, folks who were leading different departments and divisions within the City of Urbana, to understand from their perspective what some of the major challenges are. All of that is really sort of accumulated into some key findings, which is really where we are today. And what we'll spend the next few minutes walking through is the high-level findings from these multiple activities to give you a sense of where we might be going next. So that 6th step that you see in this process really is the bridge between where we are right now and where we see the future facilities master plan evolving to. By the way, I should also say, happy to entertain questions throughout this presentation. No reason to be shy about asking. Okay, so we've boiled down those multiple streams of information really into 5 key findings. And hopefully, by the way, everybody can see it on the screen in front of you, right? Okay, good. So there's a few that we'll run through in more detail in just a second, but I wanted to outline what the 5 big ones are. First, we think that there's some challenges both with distraction as well as with protocol that distract from the time that members of the City of Urbana staff have to spend on their defined responsibilities. Second, we found that current facilities have some challenges with enabling collaboration. They, in some cases, actually hinder collaborative patterns, and we think that that's a meaningful challenge that we need to address as we move forward. Third point, there are some unsafe and in some cases just unenjoyable working conditions that are impacting morale. We think that in many ways a productive staff is one that enjoys coming to work on a day-to-day basis, and so we think this could be a meaningful issue as you go forward. Fourth point, we think there's a lack of delineation between public and private space that has an impact on both employee and the citizen experience. The space immediately outside of these chambers is a good example of that, but we'll talk about it in more detail in just a minute. And then finally, storage. We actually think that that's a meaningful impact on the way that employees go through their day-to-day work lives and some of the challenges that we see in both the way that storage is handled today as well as some of the access to records. We think there's some opportunities, by the way, in all of these cases. So I know it sounds like this is a series of challenges, but what we hope to do is on the next few slides present where we see opportunities and some of the positive, both in terms of quick wins, things you can do in the relatively near term, as well as some longer term moves that might be more at the facility scale. So that first point that we just covered, the idea of distraction and the lack of clear protocol. Hopefully you can read some of the key findings from survey as well as from our focus groups. But at a really high level, I think one of the important pieces is that roughly 2/3 of employees reported having to overcome some kind of distraction over the course of a typical workday. That's an abnormally high number based on the study that we do at lots of other kinds of organizations, and so we think that there's a pretty meaningful impact of being able to try to address that. And from our perspective, as you can see kind of in the upper right portion of each slide, and that's going to be consistent for the next 5 slides, so it's a good place to look. There are some opportunities that we think are also part of being able to address some of these challenges. So first, we think that there's some ability to restore focus on core job responsibilities. We think that there are some quick wins that might be available in terms of developing etiquette in the way that and policies in the way that different spaces and different kinds of space are being used. We think that there are also, frankly, some ways that information sharing can be improved. And we don't think that these necessarily have physical impacts on the environment. We think that they are potentially just changes in behavior. That doesn't necessarily make them simpler, but it does mean that they are probably lower cost in some ways. So it won't necessarily have capital budgeting associated with these. There will be some other recommendations that you'll see in subsequent slides that I think are going to be more capital intensive. I'm happy to pause here if there are any questions. Otherwise, I can move on to the next.
Bill?
Sure. I think it's a good gap analysis, sort of to identify areas where we could make a big difference pretty quick. Do you have that broken down by department that you're furnishing to the administration?
We do, yeah. We have different, a very extensive background on each department. We're happy to provide that. We don't have it in this presentation,
okay.
But if that's something,
fine.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'll move on to the next. So the current facilities have some challenges with collaboration. We think there's potentially 2 aspects that are happening here. So the first is the relative distance between facilities within the city of Urbana. We heard in focus groups that many people make their way throughout the city over the course of their day. In some cases, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. If you work in public works, for example, and you have a responsibility that requires you to be out in the community very actively, that may be a perfectly reasonable thing for you to be spending time on. But a lot of folks end up spending time making their way between this building and public works, for example, or between any of the fire stub stations and this building. And the inefficiency that creates in the course of the day struck us as something that was relatively easy for the city to be able to address through either consolidation in some cases or potentially through an approach that enables more remote meeting. So whether that's through a phone conference or a video conference, some kind of an easier way for teams to be able to collaborate across boundaries. We'd also mention that from survey, there were some challenges that employees identified in terms of how they collaborate and the way that they interact with one another. So that's typically within a building is the way that we saw those challenges. And so there are also collaborative patterns that we think we can improve just by bringing groups together. The city building, for example, is relatively carved up, and there may be a way for us to bridge some of the divide between groups by physically bringing them together. So the opportunities in this case, again in the upper right of the slide, really represents a few key findings. We think, first of all, there may be some opportunities to evaluate current meeting space and thinking about that in a more modern way. There are relatively few meeting rooms for city staff to be able to interact with one another, and they're relatively, bless you, under-equipped for easy access for meetings to actually happen in a sort of dynamic way. Second, we think that there's a real possibility of understanding sort of the placement of, excuse me, excuse me, to be able to place the sort of more efficiently, to be able to bring teams together and increase efficiency through that. And thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of creating some kind of digital infrastructure to be able to allow remote meetings to occur more effectively across distances. Happy to pause here again if there are any questions about these findings.
What kinds of digital collaboration do you guys often suggest to organizations of this size?
So it's a good question. I think in general what we would imagine is a sort of multi-pronged process. We think that there are opportunities for using relatively low-cost and efficient tools like video conferencing software that might enable people to be able to do things. Lots of organizations, for example, as part of their subscription to a Microsoft product line, for example, would then have Teams or Skype as sort of specific products if we're thinking about that. But broadly speaking, I think we're agnostic to the specifics of any provider or manufacturer. We just think that the idea of being able to have digital collaboration across distances is important. They can be relatively low-cost tools and might even just be screen sharing more than video conferencing, if that makes sense.
Okay.
We generally do not advocate for things like sort of custom designed systems where you're thinking about a video system that would interact across distances. The camera on a laptop, it tends to be a much more effective way and frankly a lower cost way to do it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. This next finding, I think, is an important one. We found that for many employees, they felt that the working environment was not as safe and in some cases not as enjoyable as they would like. And so there were some feedback in particular about public works employees who have physically difficult jobs in some cases and have a hard time being able to deliver because of the sort of limitations of their current environment and the lack of sort of safe working conditions in some cases relative to being able to deliver in some very difficult situations like as snow season is coming upon us.
Right. The one perfect example of that is just like we dealt with the past 2 days, getting our snow operations up and running in a very confined, basically a shed on the back end of Public Works, where we literally have, a couple feet between large dump trucks and our plows are up against the wall. So when we're running a salting operation and quickly we determine that we have to switch from salting to plowing, all that work has to take place in a very small, very confined space. It's inefficient because normally we can only do one truck at a time just because of the sheer limitation of space. And frankly, it can be unsafe at times when you're right up against the edge of a building trying to hook up very heavy and very large equipment.
That extended, though, to knowledge workers as well. I think one of the pieces of feedback that we heard in a number of different settings was that and we'll go into this into more detail in the next finding, actually, but the circulation in this building, the crossing of the paths between citizens and the employees is not optimal, and that some folks felt that was also potentially creating the perception, at least, of an unsafe working condition. Being able to have too much access, frankly, from the public into the private space of a work environment. So we think the opportunities here are being able to improve physical facilities where possible. We think that there are opportunities for, first of all, creating break spaces that are independent of the kinds of space that currently exist within the campus. There may be more spaces for employees to congregate and be able to work together. We think there's an opportunity to create some more usable outdoor space, and obviously we'd like to address critical safety concerns. As part of the Phase 1 study that Vince alluded to earlier, there were a number of pieces that were physical safety that we want to make sure are addressed. And then second, we think that there's opportunities for thinking about improving morale by giving some quick wins, as I alluded to earlier, in terms of both operations and the way that teams might work together more effectively. So we think there are the possibility of being able to deliver things like employee recognition programs or other kinds of ways of rewarding staff who have been loyal members of the community who we think might feel underappreciated based on some of the feedback we heard in survey. Again, I'll pause and see if there are any questions here. Okay. So the fourth finding was about sort of the limited separation between the public in some cases and the private spaces, particularly as it relates to the building that we're in today. So what you can see highlighted on the plan is the reception area immediately adjacent to the council chambers here, in which both the public, in terms of the primary access to the building, as well as anyone who may be heading to the police window or to any other part of the building, have to sort of cross paths. And in particular, one of the challenges that I think we heard from city staff was that restrooms are in the sort of public zone, and that's an opportunity for mixing that may create sort of undesirable outcomes. So the fact that you have to walk right past the police window where there may be some untoward kind of activity occurring is something that creates the perception of a safety concern. We think that this is a not insignificant challenge, but it's one that is addressable by rethinking the circulation of this building and rethinking some of the ways that space is being organized. So the opportunities here are really to sort of realign facilities with sort of the desired city image. I think that may be a more aesthetic concern, but it's an important one. We think there's an opportunity to really create better greeting and better wayfinding for the public. We heard from a number of city staff that the public comes into this building in particular and doesn't really know where to go. And so relatively low cost, relatively simple thing like being able to have signs would be something that would be very useful. And then finally, figuring out a way to create more separation between those functions is something that we think would be really fundamental to improving the building. Any questions about this opportunity here?
Dennis?
Yeah, actually, because we are just learning about this, and I would love to, of course, look at this, your document, in the future a lot more closely.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of words.
Right, but you're really bringing up some really interesting points that has crossed my mind, but has never gone to the point of being deep concern. But I can see that the staff and our employees are dealing with this all the time, and I'm just walking through sometimes myself, tangentially, to do a couple of things during the day, and it's not a concern that's consistently on my mind, but I appreciate you bringing this up.
And I would echo the concerns about security and circulation. We've got 3 different entrances to this building, all of them open to the public. We have, and any time I come down through the lobby, I'm always running into somebody wandering around going like this, because they may be going to finance, they may want to go to Public Works, they may want to find the police, not Public Works, to community development. They may try to find the police, they may be going to the city clerk, and or just finding the bathroom, and there's a lot of uncertainty just wandering around in the lobby. So these are low-hanging fruit that we can address fairly quickly. Okay. Sorry.
Great. So our last finding really is that we think that storage is a significant issue as it relates to basically any of the facilities that we observed, but certainly as it relates to this building. And we think there's actually a couple of different ways that that's playing itself out. So first, the city of Urbana is dedicating a relatively high percentage of its space, sort of people space, to storage of one kind or another. So I think there's a statistic on there that says about 18% of the overall footprint of this building and the Public Works building are being dedicated to storage. That's higher than what we see in most other organizations. And we would recommend rethinking that. And there's really two broad brush ideas for this. First, we recognize that there are a lot of requirements that city agencies have in terms of being able to keep documents on hand and accessible to the public relatively quickly. But there are probably some best practices that certain groups have adopted and that need to be shared by all departments. So we heard, for example, that in particular finance has got a good program in place for being able to store and deaccession documents over time and have really adopted a good approach. We have not heard that shared across other departments, and so there may be just some best practices that could be shared between departments that would enable that to happen more effectively. But second, providing space that actually enables storage to occur in a fairly purpose-designed space that's sort of away from it and is in a relatively lower cost place would be something that would be desirable. So it could be then accessible but not immediately at hand, and having both a policy that it supports that as well as a consistent program would be something that we think would advantage the city significantly. It would free up space, frankly, for more people and less storage within space that was originally designed for people. So again, I'll pause and see if there are any questions about this one. To Mayor Marlin's point, I think this is, again, kind of low-hanging fruit, but it is really a meaningful issue for you.
Yes.
What percentage of the records are electronic?
That's a question I do not have the answer to, but I suspect that quite a bit is at this point. I think it's something that we can certainly look into as we sort of continue this recommendation.
I think a lot of libraries have an off-site storage for books. I mean, U of I does. They have Oak Street. And then they have a lot of digital copies, but you can always request something from the off-site.
Sure. I think the opportunity here is to obviously scan as much as we can for that immediate accessibility, but we are required to keep that physical paper copy for 5-10 years per the state requirement. I mean, we could create dedicated off-site storage for that, still have the digital accessibility, but free up the footprint on-site.
I got one more.
Yeah, go ahead.
It sounds like, and maybe you're going to cover this next, but it sounds like just the basic layout of this building is not very appropriate for a lot of the goals that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Mainly because it's divided in the middle by a large public space that separates, and then upstairs the connectivity is kind of nebulous.
Right.
So it sounds like structural reconstruction or something of the building, but you're saying there's other ways of doing it. So, or addition, maybe adding an addition to the building is going to be something we're going to have to deal with in the future.
Yeah, so I think we will consider multiple options, and part of our next phase of work is to present multiple options to you so that you can sort of think through some of these. I think right now this was very much diagnostic and understanding some of the programmatic challenges, and so how do we solve them is sort of the next step. But I'm hesitant to really propose specific things, but yes, I think rethinking this building would be a useful outcome of this study. Exactly how that plays out is something that I think we would want a little bit more dialogue and interaction to make before we'd have a specific recommendation.
Eric?
Are there other cities that have buildings that meet the, that satisfy the criteria that you're suggesting for what I'm hearing is people need to be not distracted when they need to work alone, but have access to dedicated conference or conversation places when they need to do that. And I have worked in buildings that meet that need extremely well on campus, the Beckman Institute and the NCSA building. I don't know how familiar you are with them, but they really do a marvelous job of having, of that balance. So I don't know what I've been trying to do as you're talking and thinking about what you're saying is how do you achieve that in this building that seems to have been designed without those criteria in mind at all?
Yeah, I think that is a real challenge. Having a purpose-designed building that enables people to be collaborative in some modes and then have space for focus in others is a unique condition. There's no question about it. But and the fact that this building was not designed for it, I think, is true. I mean, the point blank, everybody can sort of observe that. But I do think there are examples of other municipalities that have achieved a certain amount of civic innovation around this and that do enable people to work in a more flexible way that supports these kinds of patterns. We've seen some examples from other municipalities. For example, Iowa City has done some things that we think are really quite interesting. But that said, I think we do not want to go into this conversation and assume that this building cannot support that. I think it's really a question of to what degree can we be able to support collaborative patterns in spaces that are required to do that kind of work, and then also focused work in other places. It's not a foregone conclusion that this won't work.
I don't know how all staff will absorb this thought, but it would seem to me that it would be possible to separate the civic aspects of the responsibilities of mayor and staff from the focal in this building, and maybe occupy the entire building for those needs, and to relocate and perhaps build a new structure for police and fire, because their duties and needs seem to be rather different in focal point and equipment based.
Yeah, that is a unique condition, I'd say, having public safety and sort of city functions in the same building. That's not something that we see in many municipalities. It's not unheard of.
It's kind of like an old style doing it when the city building and had like one fire brigade with horses or something. I mean, we've got pictures of how it used to be, in 1889.
Yeah.
And maybe the modern needs require a different kind of approach.
Yeah, and by the way, I think we heard, we didn't mention this earlier, but we could have that from the fire chief and others that Station 1 is also a little substandard for what I think they would need for their functions, frankly.
Yeah, and maybe hard to get out of. I mean, you're right down here in the middle of the city, and as far as like quick egress, to answer a call, maybe a slightly different position in the city would be advantageous. So I don't know. I mean, we're going to be talking about this, I'm sure, for a year or so.
I mean, speaking, from the police department's perspective, from, upper level administration, I know there is a key adjacency with, the mayor's office, and the legal department is, from my conversations with the chief, that's very important to them. well, maybe a lot of the other core functions may be able to really relocate it off-site. That adjacency was very important in my conversation with them. That accessibility instantly as a situation may unfold.
Of course, accessibility via telecommunication or video or
And like we discussed earlier,
telephone, I mean,
that's
that's
gonna
almost
be-
as good, right?
with the digital technology, that maybe that could be a workaround for that.
Right.
Bill?
Did you find people using existing public domain tools like Zoom and GoToMeeting or anything like that to do screen sharing, collaborative efforts?
So we did ask those questions in sort of talking with city employees, for example, and it's uneven, we'll say that, across different departments. Some seem to have adapted it, others seem to not have.
I've been in some of the conference rooms here, and they're decent rooms, although the table takes up a lot of space. But just getting there is kind of embarrassing. I could imagine, bringing developers or somebody through to meet in some of the conference space. So it may be a matter of moving the rooms out closer to the public entrance or creating some kind of better entry for them too.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that may have been the last slide we were prepared to present this evening, unless there are further questions that we can talk through. I think from our perspective, the next steps will be to take this feedback, including a few notes that I took tonight, and be able to translate this into the Phase 3 findings, which will be, as I mentioned earlier, taking a look at sort of the physical assets of the city of Urbana and proposing some different outcomes, both in terms of potentially operating budget and capital budget. We actually had a meeting with Vince and Carol earlier today to talk that through.
And how will you share this document?
Well, I think Vince already has a copy, and you have it right now here. Happy to.
I'll make it accessible. I'll work with Charlie.
Okay.
I wish I had hats for all of you or something. A helmet is such a great parting gift.
You need to bring hard hats.
Yeah, right.
Mary Alice?
I just wanted to say, I've worked in a variety of offices in which they've been split in buildings, which has been incredibly detrimental to bringing groups together, to understanding what different people do, to be able to collaborate. So I would be hesitant to push you down that road, just because I've personally seen large organizations. We have about 130 people in my organization. We just recently, in the past year, moved everybody into the same building, which has really increased our ability to work together. So I just want to put that out there since we're talking about perhaps next steps.
More consolidation, yeah.
And our goal is to get people out of the furnace rooms and the closets,
Absolutely.
which is why we don't have storage space, because we have people working in our storage space. So, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any public input cards, Mr. Clerk? None. I do want to take this public input opportunity to recognize and announce that we had two bits of good news in Urbana over the weekend, or toward the end of last week. One is that the NewMed announced that they did get their license from the state, and they will be beginning to sell adult use cannabis on January 1st out of the NewMed facility, so we're very much looking forward to that business opening. And then we were also pleased to learn that the property, the southeast corner of Lincoln and University, has sold, and that's a major milestone for the Gather project to move forward. So that was also very good news, and we look forward to progress on that front. Okay, next up on the agenda is unfinished business, and it's ordinance number 2019-11-063, which is the ordinance amending Urbana City Code, Chapter 22, Article 7, Section 2291, which is an amendment to the food and beverage tax ordinance. This was, if you recall, the ordinance which authorizes a half-cent increase in the food and beverage local food and beverage sales tax. And the revenue increase is proposed as part of the plan to eliminate our structural budget deficit and close the estimated gap of about $875,000 for fiscal year 2021. The money is going to be used for recurring operating expenses, and the reason we are proposing is now so that we can plan for the budget for fiscal year 2021. In light of some questions that have arisen since this was first brought to council and some concerns that were raised, I've asked staff to first report on, to give you some context as we go into discussion tonight. Specifically, I've had questions about the impact of staff vacancies on our budget, whether or not we're saving money by not paying these salaries, at least temporarily, and whether that can be used to balance the budget. And there also have been some concerns expressed how vacancies have affected our work on specific projects, particularly the engineering, the public works vacancies. So I asked Carol to provide an update on those two items, and then Finance Director Elizabeth Hannon will discuss some of the positive and negative trends that she's monitoring that's going to impact our financial forecast for next year, and also just kind of a reminder for us all what recurring funds are versus one-time funds and what can and cannot be used to address the deficit. So I'll turn it over to Carol and then Elizabeth.
Great. Thank you. So I want to start by saying how absolutely proud I am of Public Works staff during this period of time when we are down a few folks. They have really pulled together. All the engineering staff is working as a unit now with me, and we are getting a tremendous amount of work done. There's a lot of collaboration going on between engineering and operations, which had not been the case in the past. So we're seeing, even though we have this sort of temporary condition where we're down a few positions, we're doing a lot, and I want to give you an update on a few projects, and if you have questions about others, I'd be happy to try and answer them. The other thing that's allowing us to move forward on a number of fronts is that we have a contract in place anticipating that we would from time to time need some additional help. This is for supplemental engineering services with Fair Graham, and so now we're making more use out of that so that they're supporting us doing things that had been intended to be done in-house that we don't have the capacity for. So just a couple of updates. MCOR Phase 5 on the easement acquisitions. We had roughly 30 to acquire. All of the waiver evaluations were completed in November. We've reached agreement with more than half the property owners so far. Several owners are reluctant to grant the easements, in which case we're going to do a quick redesign, and there'll be some sacrifices in certain cases, like a tree that we were trying to save will be removed, but we'll plant another tree to replace it. It's not quite the same, but so we are on track for letting in February, which will allow us to complete the project in the next construction season, which is exactly what we need to do. So that is all on track. The Lincoln and Springfield Avenues resurfacing, the design is largely done. Right now it's in Fair Graham. We've just signed a contract with them, and they're doing a quality control on the design just to make sure we haven't missed anything. We received approval from IDOT Cultural Resources, subject to review of the final plans, and we're still waiting for the environmental clearances to be completed. But that's all well underway. We're still in the state where we're trying to figure out what the best timing of that project is, whether it should go in 2020 or whether it should go in 2021, given that MCOR is going to be under construction, University Avenue is going to be under construction, the Gather project is going to be under construction, and so we just, will it be more complicated in 2020 or will it be more complicated in 2021? We're still evaluating that. The Vine and Washington Streets intersection, and this goes up from the intersection to Illinois Street as well. You're probably familiar with this. This section of street is exhibiting the ASR, the alkali silica reaction, where the concrete deteriorates. The project was originally scoped to be a resurfacing, but after conferring with both engineering and operations staff, we've determined that trying to patch this in pieces is not going to work, because what we're trying to patch is still fundamentally, problematic. And so we've decided that we're going to do a full depth reconstruction, which is going to be more expensive than what was originally intended, but will actually be money that is much better spent in the long run. So the project is going to be closer to about $1.5 million. We have $400,000 in the capital bill designated for this project, and the CIP had a placeholder of $485,000. So we're in the process now of identifying where the balance of that money will come from, and if we're able to identify sufficient local funds, because we could then not have to go through the IDOT review process, we can probably get that project done this summer when the middle school is out. So working hard to try to bring that to closure, and we have tasked that out to Fairgram to do the detailed design for us. Another project that's been in the works for a while is the Nevada Street Series Street Light Replacement Project. You'll remember that those are, there's 2 sections. It was put into 2 phases so that we could chunk it out in manageable chunks. We have the budget in the CIP is $500,000. That did not include construction observation, which we will we always needed to contract that out. So we will be amending the budget sometime in the future to reallocate $100,000 from the Busey Street project. There's a couple blocks on Busey that need to be reconstructed, but it doesn't make sense to do that before the Gather project is finished and before Lincoln and Springfield are completed. Clark Dietz is under contract for that aspect, and that will begin after classes are out at U of I this spring. And then there's also the Main and Vine Streets intersection analysis. We made the commitment to study the geometry and functionality of the intersection following the pedestrian fatality we had earlier this year. There was a delay in scoping the project, and that's been resolved. So Fairgram is performing that analysis, and will have a report to us mid-January, which we will then promptly share with the council. There's also the Kinch Street Streetlight Installation Project, which is a CDBG project being funded by CDBG money. We're getting more refined cost estimates on that, and I have preliminary indications that the cost will be roughly double of what we had been holding as a placeholder, but that there are sufficient CDBG funds available to supplement that, and that can move forward. We're also been working on, there's been a backlog of work orders based on Traffic Commission decisions. We're clearing that backlog. And we also, it came to my attention that we have multiple projects outstanding with IDOT, closing out projects that go back as far as 1999. So we are diligently working through those. The biggest one was the one that I brought to the council about a month ago, which was the amendment number 3 for the local public agency agreement for Olympian Drive. And by taking the action that you did, we're now able to recover about $200,000 that we could get refunded. So we are getting a lot done in spite of being shorthanded, and the money that is temporarily available because we're not paying the salaries will help to supplement the consulting services, and there'll be a budget amendment coming once we work out all the details with Elizabeth, coming to you so to actually implement that. And I'm happy to answer questions about anything that I mentioned or did not mention.
Couple questions. So also this time of year, I think, is usually about the time that we apply for some grant funding for side paths, and I think it's a transportation enhancement funding. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not familiar with that, but I can find out about it.
RPC kind of coordinates that. And,
Okay.
I think it's about this time of year, so I'd be curious if I'm right about that. I'm not sure.
Is that ITEP?
I think it was called ITEP.
Okay.
ITEP.
Okay, I'll check into that.
Also, what's the, I mean, by my count, we're down over half our engineering staff. Looks like early this year, we had 5 engineers and 5 engineering techs. That's with not counting the city engineer. And now it looks like we have 2 and 2. So what's the plans going forward as far as, I haven't seen any announcements for these positions. I would think that we would want to be hiring some people.
Well, what's been interesting about this is when we still had the 2 engineers, when we still had Craig and Brad, the idea, we knew there were some challenges, particularly in transportation. And the idea was, you know, there was a very necessary restructuring that took place in operations, and we really want to get the Public Works Director in on the engineering side to help inform whatever that restructuring would look like. Now that Craig and Brad are gone, and I am getting personal insight into that, it's not clear to me, based on what I just reported to you, that the model we've been using is the right one. So if we were to hire folks right now, we would be hiring them into the old model, and I really want to rethink that, and I hope it's in partnership with the new Public Works Director to figure out what the right model is. I'm not sure that in the past we struck the right balance between in-house design and so forth and using supplemental engineering services that we can kind of float up and down as needed.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I'd be curious. I'd want to kind of stay on top of that and figure out what the pros and cons are, what we're giving up if we, you know, if we don't have as many engineers. I mean, at one time we had even more than that. That was, so 2013 we had a couple more, and we've lost another. We've, I guess, shifted the job of the mapping technician or something. But I know any of our big projects that we get state funding for, federal funding, is always, the design is always contracted out. We may do some of the engineering services oversight or something on site. But really it's just, I can only think of 3 or 4 projects, like maybe Ray Street in front of the high school, North Broadway, a couple of things like that where we've actually done the design. So,
well, I can give, I think a good example is Lincoln and Springfield, where that design was all done in-house. And, you know, it's taken kind of a long time. So I think what I try to look at the opportunity that's created when something changes, and I now have so much more personal insight into this, and I think I'll be able to collaborate with the new Public Works Director to coming up with a model that's really more sustainable and gets the work done that we all expect to get done in a more timely manner. So your questions are actually, you know, they're right on. I feel like we're getting to the point where we can answer those.
okay. Yeah, and I noticed in earlier capital improvement plans, they actually said that contracting out the engineering usually adds 20 to 35, I think it's 15 to 30 in one of them, 20 to 35 in another one. So in that range, 25% of cost to the engineering. So I hope we're getting a 25% improvement somewhere else if we're spending extra money, either in time or quality or whatever. But I just...
Well, there's, and I don't know when that, I don't know what the context was for that, but there's the designing effort, there's other supplemental services, and then there's construction observation. And, you know, based on some of the stories that I've heard in the past, construction observation has been something that we've sacrificed, but then we end up with product that is substandard, not what we paid for, but it's our responsibility. So, you know, it might cost us more, but it might have been money, you know, relative to what we've done in the past, but maybe we should have spent money differently in the past. So I hope to be able to give you much better, as we go forward, more transparency into why we're making the decisions that we're making, and so that you can understand why we think they're in the best interest of the city. I think it's been far too opaque in the past.
Okay, thanks.
Sharice and then Mary Alice.
I just wanted to know, you named all these other projects, the CDBG, yeah, funds that are supposed to go toward fixing sidewalks and streets in the L subdivision,
Yes, that is on track also.
and that'll be when?
Well, there's $105,000 in CDBG money in that project, and then the total is roughly $500,000. And we have to spend the CDBG portion of that project prior to May 1, which that's another project that Fair Graham is working on, and they're helping us scope it out so that we can chunk it out and get that first tranche of money spent. And they're confident that we can meet the deadline, the May 1 deadline, and then they're helping scope out which I think the idea was there was going to be some pavement, there were pavement patching, curb replacement, sidewalk replacement, ADA compliant ramps. So they're going to help us prioritize and fit that in the allocated budget.
Okay, so in addition to the CBDG money that is going for Ellis, there are other funds that also need to be allocated to complete. You have to do the CBDG money first.
Yes.
And then for what's been sussed out for the other repairs or replacement of whatever.
Those are coming out of several different pavement maintenance line items in the CIP.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Mary Alice?
So you've gone over a number of projects that we don't quite have enough funds for. I'm wondering if you have a total amount that we're short.
We're going to have a meeting with Elizabeth on Friday, and we're going to figure all that out. And you know, there's projects that we're not going to get to this year that were in the CIP as being done in 2020, and so they just won't get spent this year. And we can, when we come with a budget amendment, we can give a full summary of how things are shifting around.
And you had mentioned that there were some projects that hadn't been closed out from IDOT back in the 90s. Do we have, it sounds to me like those are refunds, basically, that we're getting back from the state?
Some of it is simply closing out the project, like just finalizing paperwork. Some of it is, as I understand it, and I always tell the people from IDOT, okay, I'm not an engineer, so just bear with me here. Some of it is that we believe we have spent money and that we got refunds and we think everything's fine. But they can't find the paperwork. So if we can't marry everything, so make sure they have the paperwork that they need, then, so I'm like, okay, what's the worst case scenario? Then we have to refund them the money. So some of these are not large sums of money. The biggest one in terms of dollars was the roughly $200,000 item, as I understand it. But we still have to...
What year was that from? Just curious.
I want to say that was from 2014, but I could
So
go back
not the
and-
1990s.
No. But it's just we, as I understand it, what was happening was, rather than closing out paperwork, we just kept running to the next project and never finalizing things. And you know, it's not a way for us to do business. IDOT can't do business that way, and it jeopardizes, you know, our good standing to have all those loose ends. But we'll do our best to identify the paperwork that they need and make sure that we both get everything we're entitled to in terms of refunds, and that we minimize whatever we might have to pay back because we couldn't find the paperwork.
And my final question is it Fairgram? Is that who we're contracting out with?
Yes.
That's what I wrote down. Do you have an approximation of how much we're spending on that contract this year?
Well, it's a series of contracts. I have a bunch of individual numbers. I can get you the total.
It would just be good to compare that to, I mean, because we're saying we're basically kind of trying to cover some of the work that the engineers who have left with this. It would be good to get an idea of how much this is costing. Is it saving us money? Are we,
Right, and be happy to get all that. I just do feel like I want to say right now that it's important that it's not just dollar for dollar, it's dollars for productivity. So if we could save a lot of money, but we're not pushing projects out the door. So part of it is timeliness that we're paying for, but I'm happy to get the information for you.
Sharice?
Also, when will we know who's been hired for the Director of Public Works? Huh?
I'm going to leave that one for the mayor.
An offer has been made, and we're in negotiations.
Okay, I would just like to know when we're going to close that door. And how much will that input or that particular position, once it becomes filled, how is that going to affect the projects that Carol was just discussing?
It should help move them forward.
Okay, I'm just wondering if there's be a stoppage or...
No.
Oh, okay.
I promise you the answer to that is no.
Okay.
Charlie?
Just to inform you, it's, the deferral rule gets used very rarely. That was used in this particular case. And so I just want to remind you that this item is already on the table. It was previously moved by Councilmembers Brown and seconded by Councilmember Hersey, and then deferred. So it's on the table as a motion here. It's already been moved and it's on the table for discussion and voting.
Thank you for that reminder. Thank you, Carol. I think we'll move on to Bill.
So engineers do a lot more besides these projects. They do, plan review
Sure.
and right-of-way stuff and addressing emergencies and things like that. Are you confident the staff we have now is sufficient to handle everything that isn't a project that we can farm out?
Not indefinitely, but for the moment, we're fine. And if we find that we need to call on Fairgram or some other contractor to help us because something comes up that's beyond the scope of staff. But what I tried to say earlier was that I think we need to rethink the model that we're using. So it's not that we won't hire anybody, but we need to hire the right people. So I think we're fine for now. I don't want the current state to go on for too much longer, but I also am a big believer in not rushing to take an action that I might regret later. So I think we have enough breathing room, and I think we have enough outside support that we can take the time to think through whether we want to change the model going forward.
Just the length of time that it takes to fill positions, I know, well, I don't know for sure, but I've heard that there's a policy that you can't fill a position until the vacation or sick pay has been accumulated and paid off, basically. Like someone quits and then they have 3 months of sick pay left. You have to wait 3 months to hire somebody.
No, you just have to make sure you can pay for it.
Okay.
Because we don't, and as I understand it, and Elizabeth will correct me if I'm wrong, we don't budget for those payouts, that we just deal with them as they occur.
Yeah, I think that's a problem. I mean, I don't know when we can discuss that, but if we're going to be raising revenue through taxes, I'd like to see some kind of budgeting for so that there can be overlap in positions, so there can actually be somebody training on the job from the person that had the job before.
Well, although sometimes we don't have the luxury of doing that. But when someone retires, yes. When someone gives 2 weeks, no. You know.
Well, we had, it's been a year and a half since Public Works were notified officially about that.
Jared?
I don't know if Elizabeth was going to go down this path next, but the way that Diane kind of contextualized how we were going to hear about this, and we're talking about a resolution about a food and beverage tax increase, but we just had a whole long discussion about Public Works. Can we macro that back into its significance in relation to why we're considering this tax in light of everything else? I don't know if that's a you and Elizabeth question. I just don't know why we're talking about this in light of a food and beverage tax increase discussion.
Well,
That's good. I think that's a very good question, and we're going to macro back right now. I love that. I'm going to use that.
this all arose when I was getting questions and comments about using funds that were created from these vacancies to cover the budget gap for next year, and not just from council members, but from some members of the public as well. And that's why it's these dollars allocated for staff, particularly in Public Works, will be spent to keep things moving forward in Public Works. And what we're looking at is recurring revenue to pay for recurring expenses. And that's what Elizabeth will be focusing on. Is that macro enough? Okay. There's usually a reason.
If you think back almost a year ago when we talked about the last financial forecast, we expected that we would need to increase recurring revenues or decrease recurring expenditures or some combination by a total of $875,000 in fiscal year 21, which is the budget that we're going to be working on here soon. We also expected that we might need some additional revenue increases in FY22, perhaps another $375,000 to completely close this budget gap. So that was part of the plan, to eliminate the structural deficit while maintaining basic city services. That wasn't going to give us money to do anything new, to add programs or services, but just to maintain what we already have. So, as you probably suspect, throughout the year, I'm always keeping an eye on kind of what's going up and coming down, and kind of how does that affect that prediction? Are we moving closer to our goal? Or are we getting further away? And so I sat down this weekend and I kind of jotted down my notes about what I see happening. So I'm going to share those with the understanding that we will be reviewing the updated forecast probably towards the end of January, and so that will be a much more accurate prediction. So first of all, I always start with the hard stuff first. Both our police and fire labor agreements end on June 30, 2020, and so very soon we will be beginning negotiations. The outcome of negotiations is always somewhat difficult to predict. We did, of course, in the most recent forecast, and in our next forecast, we will anticipate some wage increases. But at this point, we don't really know if that's going to be adequate. Also, our AFSCME labor agreement, which covers Public Works as well as some police and finance employees, is ending 1 year following that. So we have 3 big labor agreements to negotiate coming up. Another item is that based on council input during the last budget process, we need to fund the vehicle and equipment replacement fund at a level that is sustainable without using debt. And so that's going to require about $250,000 annually. We are going to have to replace our police records management system in the near future. The current ARM system runs on that old AS400, and you've been seeing these things, you know, over the last few years. We migrated the financials off that system, and we're continuing down that path. You know, there'll be perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars in one-time cost, and then a significant recurring cost. Details are still being worked out on that. Well, we recently, or you recently, approved 3% cannabis tax, and that's certainly going to help to close the gap. that revenue is very difficult to predict. I know I gave you a pretty broad range of numbers, but that was challenging even to come up with that broad range. It could vary quite a lot from what we expect. We've also talked, at least on one occasion, about the changes in state law pertaining to sales tax and e-commerce and how that might affect us. Well, within the past few months, I spent a lot more time pondering that and did a lot of calculating and research. I think, there may have been some expectation that that was going to generate a significant amount of revenue for the city. I don't believe that's true. And anybody wants the details, I'd be happy to review the reasons why. But, I'm thinking perhaps we're looking at another $50,000 to $100,000 annually based on the e-commerce. And part of that has to do with the fact that items that are purchased online for delivery to Urbana but originate from a destination in the state of Illinois are taxed, or from an origin in the state of Illinois are taxed at the origin, not the destination. So I don't know. I occasionally buy things from Amazon, and I've noticed lately, they're pretty smart about where they locate things in their warehouses, right? I've noticed lately almost everything I buy is coming from a warehouse in Crest Hill, Illinois. So they're getting a lot of money, but we're not.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure we could invite them. The other couple of other things to note: the general fund is often a source of funds when we have other unmet needs. So, for example, some of the capital needs that Carol mentioned earlier, we may end up tapping the general fund if we have some one-time savings, particularly. But also, we had our little brush with a tornado this past year. And it's important to maintain healthy reserves, because if we ever are in a really serious situation, if we have a major natural disaster, that's where we're going to go. And I know I've said this multiple times over the past couple of years, but we're basically overdue for the next recession. It's been more than 10 years. That's probably the longest time between recessions since the Great Depression. We can't predict when that will happen exactly or how severe it will be, but that's going to affect our sales tax revenue, and it'll ultimately affect our growth and property values, and it probably will affect other city revenues as well. So I do have a couple of things that I'm counting on the positive side of the ledger. So our health insurance premiums came in lower than expected this year. So we do that on a calendar year basis. That gives us certainty for 1 year. But we do not have a multi-year deal for health insurance. So for calendar year 2020, we predicted a 12% increase, but we actually achieved something like a 9% decrease, which is pretty spectacular. The difference in this fiscal year is about $200,000. We're still expecting that one of these years coming up soon, we're going to see a big increase. Right now, we have some competition for the city's business, and that's keeping our rates down. Also, right now, sales tax is performing better than expected. That could change at any time, particularly if we get into a recession. I expect for this year we may do better than budget by perhaps $400,000, but I'm working with only 5 months of data at this point, so that's a little bit speculative. So that's kind of all the pluses and minuses that I'm keeping in my head in terms of where we're sitting. The additional food and beverage tax revenue would likely allow us to avoid additional budget reductions in FY21 and to have balanced recurring revenue and expense. If other revenues perform well, we might be able to avoid revenue increases in the following year. So that last little bit that we would make up in FY22. So the reason we're bringing this now is that we need to have some certainty as we develop the budget about what revenues we have available in that process. So we need to be clear about, do we need to go back to departments, and do we need to be talking about more cuts, or do we have the revenue that we need to maintain current services? So that's really why you're seeing this at this point.
And one other thing I'll add, there was concern about, well, I will say, we will be reviewing liquor license fees, and for some classes of the liquor license, I'll be proposing a reduction in the license fee to bring them more in line with the other licenses. Somehow they've gotten really, several different classes have gotten, I would say, just out of whack. So some of the bar owners, golf course owners, and possibly hotel motel classifications will probably see a reduction in fees, which will give some relief to the business owners. Jared?
Are we in discussion now?
You are in discussion. We have a motion on the floor.
Okay.
Thank you. Any further questions for Elizabeth?
I was going to ask
Yes,
Elizabeth.
is there- okay. Yes.
I'll lead it off because I'm sure there's plenty that we're going to go around. You weren't here, Elizabeth, the last recession, right? You were not working for the city of Urbana?
No, I started in 2014.
That's what I thought. So I guess you haven't had an opportunity to go back and look at how that affected our sales tax revenues and things like that, or is that data available
Absolutely,
to you?
I have.
Okay.
Yes. We actually, there were a number of years following that last recession where there was very slow or almost no growth in sales tax revenue, and we've actually just recently reached the point where our property values are getting back up to the level that they were prior to the recession. So, I mean, those are very real impacts that have a direct effect on our budget.
I got you. So an increase like this, though, would also maybe be affected by that. If there's a recession, people don't go out to eat as much, so on and so forth.
Perhaps, but
Do you see that correlation at all? Or?
yeah, I see a correlation. I just don't think the impact is going to be as direct.
Okay, thanks.
Mary Alice, you had a question?
Yeah, so I just want to confirm for the public that we keep talking about structural deficit. And so my first question is $875,000 that we need to reduce our budget. If we don't reduce our budget by $875,000, will we be deficit spending for next year, next fiscal year?
So when we talk about structural deficit, we're talking about the growth in recurring revenue
Sure.
and recurring expense. So would we be negative in terms of cash? No, I don't expect so, but we would be spending net reserves.
Okay, so we would not be borrowing, but we would be spending down the general fund, is what I'm hearing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so basically we would be deficit spending because we're spending more money than we're bringing in.
Correct. I expect
Okay.
that would be true.
All right. And then for this one, I noticed that the start date for it was in March. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Right. So we moved the start date back to March after this item was deferred, just to give a little more time to get that word out to all the businesses that would be affected.
But if we're trying to fix the structural deficit in 2021, why aren't we starting it in July?
We could push the effective date back. If we started in July, we wouldn't see any revenue until August. But we could do that. Yeah.
And
Part of fixing the problem is building reserves, and so.
so my last question is, we're basically leveraging 3 new taxes here to balance the budget, right? So we're doing, we're talking about the Airbnb, we're talking about the cannabis, and now we're talking about food and beverage. So those 3 items are pretty, I came up with my 3. Those 3 items are kind of new. They weren't items that we could count on. And the food and beverage tax is something that we talked about last year, but certainly the cannabis was very much up in the air. So my question is, if cannabis had not come through, what would we be talking about doing with the deficit spending next year?
We'd either be, well, are you asking specifically, like, what expenditures would we cut, or what revenues would we?
I guess I'm trying to figure out, like, what was the plan? Like, this was not a guarantee that marijuana was going to become legal and that the rules in terms of us being able to leverage a 3% tax would be in place, so.
Yeah, so at the time we did the forecast, we didn't have specifics. We knew what the number we was aiming, that we were aiming for. So as the plan came together around the time that that was approved by the legislature, but certainly we would have had to had a different plan if we couldn't include that, which would have been either further expenditure reductions or some alternate source of revenue.
So is there a plan for the cannabis and the food and beverage tax, since that would be, if this was approved, would go into place on January 1st and March 1st? Is there a plan for that revenue for this fiscal year?
No, not specifically, and we won't have that cannabis tax revenue this
October.
year.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably not until October. So,
But we would have the food and beverage.
we would have the food and beverage, and that could help us bridge the gap until we start receiving the cannabis tax revenue.
But we weren't, okay, all right, I'll drop it.
Sharice?
Just to kind of piggyback on what you were talking about, where the cannabis tax revenue, also, it's my understanding that a percentage of that revenue also is supposed to be earmarked to deal with the communities that have been hit hard with the war on drugs, and that there has to be certain programs put in place using that revenue.
So the cannabis bill, I think, was, I don't know, like at least 600 pages. It was enormous, and there are a lot of earmarks that come out of the state portion. So then the cities were allowed to impose a local sales tax on cannabis, which we did. There's also a piece that's going to be directed to the city that's designated specifically for, I think, law enforcement and education purposes related to drug interdiction efforts, or the language that was something like that. That piece will, and we have no idea how much that's going to be. Nobody's been able to provide an estimate up to this point. So that will be put in a pot and distributed to all the local governments on a per capita basis, and that will go into our police special fund, which is where we put funds that are restricted for specific police purposes. And then so it'll be segregated so that we can make sure it gets spent according to the purpose that's designated in the law.
Okay. I'll have to research that.
Bill?
I'm sorry, did you say the cannabis, we wouldn't see the cannabis tax until October?
Right.
Okay.
So in the trailer bill that was approved in the veto session, or the original bill had an effective date, I think, of September 1st. In the trailer bill, they moved the effective date until July 1st. So, but by the time that goes through the system, typically there's a 3-month lag for all sales tax revenues, so, yeah.
So the people standing in line on January 1st aren't going to be paying Urbana sales tax?
Well, they'll be paying they'll be paying state
not-
and home rule sales tax,
not
but
the
they won't
cannabis.
be paying the cannabis tax.
Ah, okay.
Right. The reason why we asked you to approve that so early was that there was some talk that the trailer bill might include a January 1 effective date. But I think, in fact, the Department of Revenue just wasn't able to make that happen. And so July 1 was the date that was
We
approved.
probably will get a better idea about how much that tax will be, though, if we can we get that information like in January, February, March as they start doing sales?
So that information is available to city staff. Each of us has signed a confidentiality agreement. So we can't share that unless we group a certain number of businesses together,
But the
because it's
predictions
considered
should get better.
confidential to those businesses. But we should have a better idea after we get some experience, yes.
Yeah, I noticed in the article in the paper, just there's a big difference in what we were estimating versus what Champaign was estimating, and I don't think the traffic on Neal Street is that much more than our traffic, so I don't know. We'll see. Also, as far as kind of predicting the future, there will be a $1 an hour increase in minimum wage, I think, for the next few years, every year. So that's basically 10% increase for the low wage people. And a lot of the food and beverage comes from fast food and stuff that have probably a third of their costs are or wages. So it seems like there's going to be some inflation sort of built into food and beverage going up maybe 2 or 3% a year. Do you use that sort of, will that play into your calculations and predictions for revenue?
Sure, it's probably something that I'll consider, but I mean, to be honest, I don't have nearly as much time as I would like to spend digging into the
Yeah.
details on revenue projections. Yeah.
And say it increases it by 3%. What's our food and beverage, annual food and beverage currently?
I
It's like
think we're at about,
600?
I want to say closer to 800 currently.
800, so you're talking about maybe $25,000 or something?
Mhm.
Okay, thanks.
Jared?
Piggybacking on that, Elizabeth, have we looked at other legalization states and watched any macro differences in sales? I'm sure everybody sees a large uptick in the first year, maybe the first 2 years, but then I imagine it tapers off. It doesn't continually increase afterwards.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely. Colorado was the best example because their data was readily available, and I think they've been legalized for the longest period of time. But yeah, typically there'll be. It seems like there will be pretty steady growth, but at some point, I think we expect that to level off.
Any other questions? Mary Alice?
I don't think I quite understand. Bill had asked about the amount that we currently get in the food and beverage tax, and was it 800,000? Is that?
I don't have my budget in front of me. That was kind of a guess.
Well, in our memo, it says increasing the food and beverage tax from 1.5 to 2% is expected to generate $400,000.
Okay, then I probably was incorrect. It would be more like 1.2 million.
Okay.
Jared?
Just one last comment. I know that we certainly have seen a lot of feedback about this particular tax, and I know we all had conversations about the things we were willing to look at as far as accepting taxes and putting taxes on the rolls for balancing our budget this year. And I think we've had some hard conversations with folks about how that's going to affect their businesses, but I would just like to continually stress that we've got to consider, especially our local small businesses who are, cornerstones of why people come to Urbana, what makes our image in Urbana what it is, why people want to be here, what makes us well known. Every time we choose to do something that hurts those businesses, it makes it that much harder for them, makes their longevity that much more difficult, makes our lives more difficult because, that's our lifeblood. That's what draws people to Urbana. So just want to make sure we all consider that as we look at these things going forward and how that's going to affect, our large scale, what we're doing here and what we're trying to achieve.
Eric?
But let's put that in quantitative perspective. We're saying that the tax on food and beverage consumed on premises is going to increase by 0.5% from so every dollar be 99.5 cents. So I just think we ought to understand what the size of the hit is.
And I do appreciate your perspective on that, Jared, and that's why for the past 2.5 years, instead of turning only to revenue increases, we have spent a great deal of time, as you know, reorganizing, restructuring, reducing spending, improving efficiencies, looking for ways to save in every possible corner of this building. And I think that was with some revenue increases. So I think that was a very responsible approach to take. And I think we continue to go that route as from going forward. So, Dennis.
And probably the area that we could put the most attention on in the future will not be food and beverage anymore, but it would be of great value to us to have more new development in this community. We are on the brink of getting a few projects finally started, and once they're built, we will be able to benefit from new revenues in those areas, and all we can do is continue to increase new business opportunities in our community.
I forgot the concerted effort at economic development and growth. So there will be some announcements coming down the pike. So, are we ready to vote? Any further discussion? Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmembers Brown,
Yes.
Hazen,
No.
Hersey,
Yes.
Jacobson,
Yes.
Miller,
Yes.
Roberts,
Yes.
Wu.
Yes.
That motion passes. We move on to reports of the standing committee. That would be Councilmember Miller.
All right, so last week the Committee of the Whole met and sent a number of resolutions, one ordinance, and one meeting schedule forward to the full council to be taken with a single vote. We're going to vote twice to make this happen, once to approve their being put on the consent agenda, and once to approve them once they're approve the consent agenda once they're on the consent agenda. So, on behalf of that committee, I would like that we consider approval and adding these items to the consent agenda. That would be resolution number 2019-12-054R, resolution approving an intergovernmental agreement with Danville, Illinois for purchase of asphalt emulsion. Ordinance number 2019-12-071, an ordinance amending Urbana City Code sections 225 and 228. And resolution number 2019-12-055R, a resolution amending City Council rules and Committee of the Whole rules, and the approval of the 2020 City Council and Committee of the Whole meeting schedule.
Does anyone request moving any of these items to the regular agenda? Okay, we have no public input cards related to these items.
Okay, so I would move that those four items be appear in the consent agenda.
Second.
Motion to consider the consent agenda was made by Chairman Miller, seconded by Sharice. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Okay.
Okay, and for that committee, I will move passage of those four stated items be passed.
Second.
Moved by Jared, seconded by Eric. Motion, are there any questions or comments? Mary Alice.
Well, Carol just walked out of here, but I was going to thank her for her additional information that she
No,
gave
she's
us.
right there.
Thank you for providing us more information on the asphalt and the contract with Danville. Okay, well,
Do you have any questions of Vince of the spray patcher while he's here? We'll give you a demonstration in the spring. It's really a remarkable piece of equipment. And I digress. Okay, with no further questions, will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmembers Brown,
Yes.
Hazen,
Yes.
Hersey,
Yes.
Jacobson,
Yes.
Miller,
Yes.
Roberts,
Yes.
and Wu.
yes.
That motion passes. Reports of special committees. Okay, reports of officers. Moving on to new business. We have ordinance number 2019-12-072, an ordinance levying taxes for fiscal year beginning July 1st, 2019, ending June 30th, 2020. Elizabeth?
So this is just the final step in the process of levying taxes for 2019. And I know it's probably a little foggy, it is for me, but we talked about this, I think, six or 8 weeks ago. There are actually 3 ordinances that are packaged here together. So the first one levies the taxes. The second one then directs the county clerk to abate or reduce the corporate purpose levy to achieve that $34.99 rate, so to maintain the current tax rate. And then there's a third ordinance that abates debt service payments, because when we originally issued those general obligation bonds, there were instructions included to the clerk to levy taxes. So each year we have to come back and say, but don't levy those taxes because we have the money to pay the bonds. So I think you've heard it, the rest of it all before. So.
Any questions, Elizabeth? Comments? Eric?
We've just voted for a revenue increase, a very small percent, which will result in a small percent increase in food and beverage. And now I'm looking at a decision to go with the lower rate of two possible rates for the property tax levy, the 13499 as opposed to 1355, which are pretty small. In fact, I guess they're sort of like the same 0.5% that we were talking about. But we have unmet needs. I mean, our streets are terrible. Our social services, I think, are inadequate. Why are we going? It's a very, very small fraction of property tax. Why are we going for the lower number?
So I think when we originally discussed the strategy with the mayor, the difference actually was, I think, the difference between the $34.99 rate and the $35.5 rate was something like
That's right.
$30,000. It was pretty small.
I see. So okay, so the revenue is quite small.
The revenue on this one is quite small, the difference.
I see.
But I think the mayor felt like the benefit to taxpayers of keeping that lower rate, even though it's only slightly lower, was more important.
Well, I'm not going to hold my breath and refuse, but nobody would notice the higher rate.
Republicans.
Dennis?
That's
It's come up to me, or to, I think in general, over and over and over again when people are comparing where they want to live between Urbana and Champaign, the proportion of property taxes that they are going to be expecting to pay. And it's been, I think, a wise decision by this city for quite a few years to try to maintain either a match to the Champaign city rate or to try to better it and not to exceed it. And I think it's the conversation in the community about tax burden that we have to be aware of. Even though the city itself only receives about 13% of the actual property taxes that are levied, because so much of it is going to our community college, our bus, our MTD services. The park district takes a bunch. Of course, the city, the library, the schools take the largest amount. The sanitary district takes something, I believe. So, I mean, the city is taking a small little handful from the giant pot of property taxes. And we're the only people who have actually tried to maintain a level and to resist raising property tax levy over the years, while everybody else has dipped into the property tax pool more liberally. So to try to maintain our public image as a conservative and respectful, unburdening community as much as we can, which is only 13%, I think still has value to our community.
I think this policy stems back to when the Carl properties went off the tax rolls and everyone's bill went up about 10% in 1 year. And we were on the council then, and the decision was made to try to hold the line on at least our share of the property taxes. Now, if we really in the future, and we're going to be having this discussion fairly soon, I think, is how do we really seriously address the infrastructure needs of the community? And that's when we'll start talking about revenue options. So I think for the next year anyway, I just felt we should maintain what we had last year, which was the slightly lower rate. due to the increase in EAV that we experienced. And now, as we have growth in over the next few years, we'll have some other options. But at this point, when you talk to people, the one tax that comes up over and over again is the burden of property taxes. That's the one that hits everybody the hardest, I think. Mary Alice.
So we have these, I guess, property tax levies in which we hope that Carl Properties and OSF will come back on the books. And last week we did the township. We levied the township's amount. And I asked about the 31%, and I think the 25% from township, if I'm remembering correctly. Why was there a difference between our estimate and their estimate?
I believe we completed our estimate before they completed theirs, and so there's the property tax system in Illinois requires you to do a significant amount of guesswork if you want to target a specific tax rate. So we were looking at, we knew what the assessments were, what was in the preliminary abstract that the county assessor certified, but what we didn't know was what was happening with the Board of Review in terms of their decisions on the appeals. And so there's some guesswork involved in looking at all those appeals, and there was a very large number of appeals this year, and just trying to figure out like what was a safe number.
So basically assessing, because there's a whole bunch of properties, which properties might come back on the rolls. Is that what?
So the increase in assessments is really more focused on, it includes the hospital properties, but I think that variance has more to do with what was happening at the Board of Review. We know the numbers for the hospital properties.
Okay. All right.
I think it's certain that they will not, the hospital properties will not be back on the tax rolls this coming year. Jared.
I'd like to make a motion.
Okay.
I'll move ordinance number 2019-12-072, an ordinance levying taxes for fiscal year beginning July 1, 2019 and ending June 30th, 2020 be approved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Moved by Jared, seconded by Dennis. Any further discussion?
I would
Yes.
just like to make a comment. I totally understand where Eric is coming from, and I would gladly increase that on my personal property taxes to see better roads in Urbana, and I think a lot of people would agree with us. And for Ward 7 residents watching this in particular, if you want to tell me about it, please do, because that's, we're here to take into consideration your voices and your opinions. So I just wanted to make that known, that I wouldn't disagree, Eric.
Eric.
Well, I will stipulate that you can't really build a lot of roads for $30,000. So I will add property tax has a lot of symbolic value and symbolic weight. So I intend to vote in favor of this.
But we do need to come up with a plan to seriously address our infrastructure needs. So, one way or another. Okay, we have a motion on the floor. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmembers Brown?
Yes.
Hazen?
Yes.
Hersey?
Yes.
Jacobson?
Yes.
Miller?
Yes.
Roberts?
Yes.
Wu?
Yes.
Mayor Marlin?
Yes, that motion passes. Next up is ordinance 2019-12-073, which is an ordinance directing the Champaign County Clerk to abate the tax levy for the General Corporate Fund for the tax year beginning July 1st, 2019 and ending June 30th, 2020. Is there a motion?
I'd like to make a motion to approve.
I'll second.
Moved by Jared, seconded by Mary Alice. Any discussion, questions? Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmembers Brown?
Yes.
Hazen?
Yes.
Hersey?
Yes.
Jacobson?
Yes.
Miller?
Yes.
Roberts?
Yes.
Wu?
Yes.
Mayor Marlin?
Yes, that motion passes. Next is ordinance number 2019-12-074, an ordinance directing the Champaign County Clerk to abate a portion of the 2019 tax levy related to General Obligation Bonds Series 2012 and General Obligation Bonds Series 2014.
I'll make that motion to approve.
Second.
Moved by Jared, moved by Dennis, seconded by Jared. Any discussion? Will the clerk please call the roll?
City Council members Brown?
Yes.
Hazen?
Yes.
Hersey?
Yes.
Jacobson?
Yes.
Miller?
Yes.
Roberts?
Yes.
Wu?
Yes.
Mayor Marlin?
Yes, that motion passes. Last item on the agenda is an appointment to the Market at the Square Advisory Board, and I'm pleased to bring the appointment of Molly Oberg to the Market at the Square Advisory Board. Her term ends June 30th, 2021. She's the owner and manager of Meyer Produce, a 35-acre fruit and vegetable farm in Camargo, Illinois. Molly will be filling the board position vacancy in the, quote, greater than 4-year producer/baker/grower, end quote, category. And for those wondering why someone outside the city of Urbana is being appointed to this position is precisely because there are specific categories on the Market at the Square Advisory Board, and that was done in order to have a representation of all the different vendors at the market, and there was no residency requirement because our vendors come from a fairly large region. Is there a motion?
I'll move that we accept Molly Oberg for the Market at the Square Advisory Board.
I'll second that.
All right. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
I have a question. Because we can discuss now, right?
Well,
Just a minute. Where is Camargo?
Camargo is south of here. Yeah.
South of Villa Grove.
Okay.
4 miles south of Villa
I've just
Grove.
I've never heard of Camargo.
That's where they make Camaros.
Eric. Thank you.
You should visit Camargo, Eric. It's actually a very nice community. It's a very pretty town. Okay, will the clerk, or let's see, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? That motion passes. And then we will be appointing a person to the newly created position of food truck vendor as well. Taking applications, actually. This meeting stands adjourned. Thank you.